Missed information.
Thank you, Emily. So it's a very, very widely reported story, but I can't remember a more powerful example of how hard the media works to mislead the British public in connivance with right-wing politicians like Farage and Johnson and the rest of them. So the story begins in 1715, effectively, when the Chagos Islands were part of France's Indian Ocean possessions, administered through the Île-de-France. Fast forward to 1814, and the Treaty of Paris saw France cede the Chagos Islands to the United Kingdom. Fast forward to 1965, the United Kingdom split the archipelago away from Mauritius and formed its own British Indian Ocean territory. So they became one of the last outposts of the British Empire in November of 1965. They had previously been home to the Chagosians. The United Kingdom elected between 1967 and 1973 to expel them all. It literally picked people up from their ancestral homes and moved them to somewhere else, in order to enable the United States to build its naval support facility on Diego Garcia. Right, hands up who knew all this, especially if you're very cross about what Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and the Daily Mail have told you about the Chagos Islands. Hands up if you knew all of this, especially the bit about just being lifted up from your home and dropped somewhere completely differently. So that culminated in 1973. The naval support facility operating under a special agreement. So it was between July and September of 1971 that the forced removal of Diego Garcia's population mostly took place. Okay, so then the sovereignty dispute kicks in because Mauritius reasonably has a long-standing claim to the territory that was there, well, technically theirs once, but French, I think it was Dutch for a while. And then you come to the question of how the UK was able to hang on to it. And the answer to that became clear in June of 2017, about a year after Britain voted to leave the European Union. So once again, Messrs Farage, Johnson, Rees-Mogg and the rest of them are somewhat relevant to our tale, to our twisting tale. Representatives from 193 nations assembled at the United Nations General Assembly to discuss a matter concerning the UK. Should the United Nations request an advisory opinion from its disputes court on the incendiary issue, wrote a journalist from Politico in November of last year, of one of Britain's final imperial treasures, the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean. In other words, was that 1967 separation of the islands from Mauritius as part of the decolonisation efforts lawful or unlawful? Had it breached international law by forcibly picking up people from their ancestral homes and dropping them somewhere else to make way for a US military base? Now, the Assembly's verdict was, spoiler alert, a resounding yes. And a lot of lawyers would say to you at this point, of course it was. So how had we got away for it so long? Well, previously, the European Union would have acted in alliance with its fellow member. In other words, by the time the vote came, when the speeches were over, 94 countries voted in favour of a referral to the ICJ. And just 14 voted with the United Kingdom against it. Out of the EU countries present, only Croatia and Hungary voted in accordance with us. Cyprus voted the other way, and all the other EU members abstained. And what's interesting about that is that would not have happened previously. The European Union, being a bloc, both political and trading, would have acted not necessarily as one, but certainly with a much greater sense of collective power. Who do you think was in charge of our diplomatic efforts at this point? Who do you think was charged with winning over former allies that we had just embarked upon a 2-year-long period of insulting? I'll tell you, who would have been the worst possible bloke to be charged with keeping everything sweet with our former fellow members of the European Union? Yeah, you're right. The bloke who compared Germans to concentration camp guards. So Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, had the job and it may have proved to be an impossible job, even in the hands of someone who isn't an absolute menace. His job was to keep things sweet. His diplomatic efforts were spearheaded by Boris Johnson, and they failed miserably. Philippe Sands was a legal advisor to Mauritius in the Chagos case, one of the country's leading lawyers, and he says Brexit dropped from the heavens, quite frankly. There is no question that, but for Brexit and Boris Johnson, the resolution would have had less chance of reaching the General Assembly or being adopted with such a large majority. A Foreign Office official, a former civil servant, speaking anonymously to Politico, said it was widely viewed at the time in the Foreign Office, that's Boris Johnson's Foreign Office, that all EU countries and their allies ordinarily vote down such a motion affecting another member state at the General Assembly. But post-Brexit, we lost that protection. So the UK did not benefit from the EU votes and those of its allies. And hence the wheels being set in motion to Chagos leaving today. In a way, this is the first element of Brexit leading to the UK losing territory. Yeah, but we've still got sovereignty. It showed how that initial grab for purported sovereignty, might actually lead to its diminution. And on it goes. David Hannay, a former ambassador to the United Nations, who now sits as a crossbench peer, also picks up on the pre- and post-Brexit positions. Before Britain left, he writes, Britain enjoyed pretty rock-solid support at the United Nations and a working assumption that the EU stands by its members' definition of their sovereignty and territorial integrity. You know what happens next. You could sense the power slipping away, recalled Philippe Sands. That last humiliating defeat at the UN when the General Assembly voted to accept the ICJ's opinion that the previously explained acts had been unlawful. Guess how many countries supported the UK and the US by then? The US, of course, have subsequently come out in support of what is going on. Guess how many countries were left on our side by then? 116 on the other side. Guess how many countries we were left with after Boris Johnson's diplomatic efforts? 4. 4 countries left batting alongside us and the United States, although the United States, of course, have subsequently endorsed the deal. And there it is. So you're left with the choice of either not complying with the ICJ's ruling or, and therefore, essentially exploding your rationale for being in it at all, the International Court of Justice, or abiding by its decision and doing what was done yesterday. So, roads lead back to Brexit, and responsibility lies in part with Boris Johnson. So what does Boris Johnson do? Starts attacking Keir Starmer. Sometimes when I do a misinformation, it's funny. Sometimes when I do a misinformation, it is illuminating and not necessarily that important. Sometimes when I do a misinformation, it is a crystal clear depiction of how completely corrupted right-wing media and right-wing politics in this country has become. Because how many people here have heard various Brexiters, buffoons, spivs and charlatans clutching their pearls and gnashing their teeth about the so-called Chagos Islands deal? How many commentators who would struggle to tie their own shoelaces but somehow felt qualified to tell you to vote for Brexit and to support Boris Johnson and to applaud Liz Truss's budget? How many of them have also been exhorting you recently to rage against the signing of the deal, that the Chagos arrangement is an appalling insult to the United Kingdom, a surrendering of sovereignty, some sort of surrender, a failure? Because if it is any of those things, and spoiler alert, it isn't, but if it were any of those things, it would have been a disaster caused in large part by Brexit and accelerated by Boris Johnson. And yet the people moaning and wailing and whining loudest about it are the people whose voices were also loudest, whose wails were also strongest, and whose whining was also endless during the run-up to the actual referendum vote. It is almost as if these people had no idea what they were talking about, what they were doing, or what the consequences would be. So much so that now a direct consequence of what they did in 2016 is something that they are attacking as being unacceptable, and somehow the responsibility of, once again, the man charged with trying to undo some of the damage that has been done. And of course there was another alternative, which would be to defy the International Court of Justice, to become sort of de facto international outlaws, or to surrender our membership of it. That would have been the alternative. And that is the truth. Those are the facts. And this is
Missed information.